The late afternoon sun slanted across the endless plains, setting the rolling hills ablaze with hues of amber, copper, and molten gold, a reflection of the turbulence in Emily's heart, a heart that had once been light, playful, and filled with laughter, now weighed down by months of unbearable grief that seemed to seep into every corner of her life. Ever since the fire that had stolen her family, leaving behind nothing but charred wood, ash, and echoes of laughter turned to silence, Emily had moved through each day like a ghost, her hands trembling as they brushed against the scorched remnants of her childhood home, the smell of smoke still clinging stubbornly to the walls, to her clothes, to her very skin. The small town she had known all her life felt hollow now, every familiar street and corner tainted with memories that refused to fade, and she wandered through it in a daze, her eyes unfocused, her thoughts a tangle of sorrow and unspoken what-ifs. Every sunrise brought with it a fresh wave of despair, a gnawing ache that no amount of routine or distraction could soothe, and she found herself searching for spaces where the weight of grief could loosen its hold, even if only for a fleeting moment. On this particular afternoon, when the sky above the distant mountains glowed with the soft lavender and rose of early dusk, she found herself walking along the edge of town, past the weathered barns and quiet fields, drawn by the open expanse of prairie that stretched toward the horizon in a way that promised freedom, or at least the illusion of it. The wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush and dry earth, brushing against her cheeks with a gentleness that almost felt like a whisper, urging her forward, urging her to step outside the walls of her sorrow. She had convinced herself that solitude was her only sanctuary, that human connection had become a luxury she could no longer afford. But as she stepped closer to the fence line where a lone ranch stood, she noticed him, an ordinary cowboy by every outward measure, yet somehow entirely extraordinary in the way he occupied the space around him. He leaned against the rough-hewn fence with an ease born of years spent outdoors, broad shoulders silhouetted against the fading light, his hat tilted just enough to shadow eyes that gleamed with warmth and a quiet intelligence. His presence was calm, grounded, yet there was an undercurrent of energy that seemed to pulse through him, subtle but impossible to ignore, as if the land itself had conspired to create this moment, this intersection of grief and hope. Emily froze mid-step, her boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt as her heart began a rhythm it hadn't known in months, quick and uneven, a reminder that she was still capable of feeling, of being stirred by the world in ways that weren't just pain. She hadn't planned to speak, to engage, to allow herself the vulnerability that came with acknowledging another human presence. Yet she found her gaze drawn to him, compelled by a force she didn't understand, a magnetic pull that seemed to bypass logic and reason entirely. The sound of hooves clattering against dry earth as his horses moved in the corral nearby, the faint clink of leather and metal, the whisper of wind through the tall grass. All of it coalesced into a symphony that made the world feel alive again, vibrant and urgent. And Emily realized with a jolt that she had not felt this acutely alive since before the fire, before the loss that had hollowed her out. There was an intimacy in that quiet observation, a silent communication between them that needed no words. The tilt of his head, the way his eyes lingered on her with curiosity and patience, the subtle shift of weight that suggested readiness without intrusion. Every fiber of her body, every nerve ending seemed to respond, sending shivers up her spine that had nothing to do with the cool breeze brushing across her arms. Fear and longing warred within her, fear of disappointment, of pain, of being drawn into a connection she might not survive emotionally, and longing for warmth, for the reassurance of touch, for the human presence that had been absent from her life for far too long. Yet in that suspended moment something indefinable passed between them, a recognition that defied explanation. It was not pity in his eyes, nor casual interest, but a steadiness, a quiet acknowledgement that somehow he saw her, not the grieving girl haunted by loss, but the person buried beneath it, the part of her that had been waiting, holding her breath, for someone to remind her that life could still contain beauty, still contain desire, still contain moments of joy even after devastation. She felt a tremor deep in her chest, a flutter of something fragile and terrifyingly hopeful, and for the first time in months, She allowed herself to linger in his presence, without retreating, without fleeing from the vulnerability that surged like an uncharted river through her veins. And though she could not have known it then, though she could not have foreseen the torrent of emotions that would follow, this single encounter, this simple, ordinary presence of a cowboy leaning against a fence in the golden light of dusk, was the hinge on which the next chapter of her life would turn, a subtle but irrevocable shift that would begin to unravel the tight coils of grief and open her to the possibility of love, connection, and ultimately, a kind of healing that she had thought forever beyond reach. The wind seemed to pause for a heartbeat, as if holding its breath in anticipation, and Emily, trembling despite herself, realized that the world could feel full again, that her heart might beat with more than sorrow, and that in the quiet strength of a stranger who seemed so ordinary yet so profoundly alive, she might find the spark to ignite her own long-dormant spirit. And in that fragile, suspended moment where pain and hope existed side by side, she felt the stirrings of a truth too large to name aloud, that grief was not the end, that love could return even after devastation, and that sometimes the simplest gestures, a glance, a shared silence, a presence that refused to intrude, could begin to unravel the barriers around a wounded heart, one gentle thread at a time. Emily's eyes never left him, her body rooted to the spot as if the earth itself had decided she must stand witness to this improbable intersection of loss and possibility. And in that gaze, both of them understood that something had shifted, quietly yet irreversibly, the moment their worlds touched in the dying light of the day. Emily's steps toward the fence were hesitant at first, tentative, as though each inch she covered brought her closer not just to the man leaning there, but to a precipice she had spent months avoiding. The cliff of vulnerability where grief and desire intersected in an uncharted territory she was terrified to navigate. Her hands, calloused from long hours of chores and the heavy labor of maintaining the remnants of her family's land, twitched as she reached the wooden rails, brushing against them almost unconsciously, grounding herself against the reality of a world that still existed beyond the memory of fire and loss. The cowboy shifted slightly, his gaze following her movement with an effortless patience, the kind that suggested he understood boundaries without needing to verbalize them, that he could sense the fragile architecture of a wounded heart without intrusion, and that awareness stirred something within Emily she had thought permanently dormant, the longing for connection, for recognition, for the warmth of another human being who could see her not just as a shadow of sorrow, but as a woman who had once known laughter, hope, and love. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as the wind rustled through the tall grasses surrounding them, carrying with it the mingling scents of sage, horse sweat, and the faint, lingering aroma of the prairie itself, raw, untamed, and alive. The simplicity of it, the ordinary perfection of the moment should have been grounding, calming, yet it had an almost disorienting effect on her, like the first sip of cold water after wandering too long under the relentless sun. Refreshing, yes, but shocking, jolting, impossible to ignore. She found herself drawn to the strength in his stance, the quiet steadiness in the way he held himself, a man whose presence did not demand attention yet commanded it anyway, as if he were in harmony with the land around him, part of its enduring rhythm. And in that harmony, Emily sensed a possibility she had not allowed herself to even imagine, that someone could exist in the world who might meet her grief not with judgment or pity, but with understanding, patience, and the capacity for a gentle unspoken intimacy. Her heart, so long shuttered, began to flutter in cautious rhythms, hesitant yet eager, like a bird testing the edges of its cage, and she wondered if perhaps the universe had orchestrated this encounter, placing him here at the precise edge of her world where hope had once flickered and died, only now to be reignited by the simple gravity of his presence. The cowboy spoke then, his voice low and rich, carrying the smooth cadence of the plains, neither rushing nor lingering too long, his words simple, yet laden with a comfort she had not anticipated. You don't belong out here alone at this hour. There was no accusation, no condescension, only a gentle observation, a kindness that seemed to seep into the very marrow of her bones, loosening the tension she had carried for months. the relentless tension of living in a body and mind still haunted by absence. She hesitated, caught off guard by the attention, by the concern, by the undeniable empathy in a man whose eyes seemed to reflect understanding rather than mere curiosity. Her lips parted, and a dry laugh escaped, a laugh tinged with sadness, yet soft, almost shy. I like the quiet," she admitted, her voice trembling despite her best effort to keep it steady, revealing far more than she intended. "It reminds me that there's still something beyond everything else." He nodded, a small, knowing motion that somehow conveyed more than any elaborate speech could, as though he recognized the invisible chains of sorrow that clung to her and understood the courage required simply to admit she needed a breath of air outside her grief. There was a pause then, the kind of pregnant, charged silence that felt as though the prairie itself had stilled in respect for the unspoken acknowledgement between them, and Emily felt a ripple of sensation, subtle yet undeniable, a warmth radiating from his nearness that was entirely new, entirely frightening, and entirely intoxicating. She became aware of her heartbeat, the rapid thrum echoing through her chest as if trying to escape, a bodily reminder that she was alive, that her nerves could still spark with anticipation, with the almost terrifying possibility of desire. His presence was grounding, yet it carried a thrill, a silent invitation into a space she had not entered for months, a space where grief could coexist with hope, where longing could mingle with the gentleness of trust, where the possibility of love might begin to emerge from the ashes of loss. The conversation that followed was small at first, seemingly mundane, yet it carried a weight far beyond the words themselves. He asked about the prairie, about her work, about the land she tended, and Emily found herself speaking in ways she hadn't in months, revealing fragments of herself like scattered petals she had long kept hidden. With each answer, each shared glance, each small laugh, her walls seemed to falter, one brick at a time, and she noticed the subtle ways he leaned in just enough to show interest, the careful attentiveness with which he listened, the slight tilt of his head that communicated patience and respect for the fragile heart she had tried to shield from the world. Hours seemed to stretch and compress all at once, the fading light of evening casting long shadows across the land. Yet neither of them moved. Neither of them broke the delicate spell that had woven itself between them. In the quiet intimacy of shared solitude, Emily felt her grief ease slightly, not vanish, not dissipate entirely, but loosen, soften, as though the presence of another human being who recognized her pain without attempting to fix it could provide a balm stronger than any she had imagined. She realized with a jolt that she had begun to trust him, not in the casual passing sense, but with a depth that made her breath catch in her throat, with a trust born of unspoken understanding and the subtle, steady assertion that he would not rush, would not demand, would not take advantage of the fragile state in which she had existed for so long. There was something unspoken, a magnetic tension that drew her closer, that made her aware of every nuance of his presence. The warmth of the sun on his shoulders, the subtle scent of leather and earth, the rhythmic pulse of his breathing. Each element combining to create an atmosphere that was at once grounding, intoxicating, and terrifying in its intensity. And then, without warning, as if the prairie itself had leaned forward to witness the moment, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture so simple, so unassuming, yet electric with meaning, that Emily felt her entire being shiver, with the realization that this man, the man she had thought was merely a passing figure in her quiet, grief-filled world, was capable of stirring something deep inside her, something she had convinced herself would never awaken again. The possibility of love, desire, and connection. Her breath caught unsteady, and she looked up into his eyes, finding there not just the reflection of the fading sun, but an understanding, a patience, a promise unspoken yet palpable, and she understood with a terrifying clarity that her life, so long defined by absence and sorrow, might be poised on the edge of a transformation that was at once exhilarating and profoundly frightening. In that single fleeting touch, in that careful intentional act of proximity and acknowledgement, Emily felt a fracture in the wall she had built around her heart, a crack through which the first tentative rays of hope could seep, and she realized that she had begun to open, not fully, not without fear, but enough that she could feel the first stirrings of something that had seemed lost forever, the capacity to trust, to desire, and perhaps to love again. The sky deepened into a rich indigo as twilight settled over the prairie, stars pricking the heavens one by one like distant promises, each a faint spark in the vast darkness that mirrored the fragile glimmer awakening in Emily's heart. She stood by the fence, her fingers still lingering where his had brushed against hers, a contact so fleeting yet electric that it seemed to ignite every nerve ending along her arms and chest. The wind, now cooler, tousled her hair and carried the earthy scent of horse and sage, blending with something else she could not name, something undeniably tied to him, to the warmth emanating from his presence, to the subtle way he had allowed her grief to exist without judgment. The world around them had narrowed to the space between his steady gaze and her tentative response, a liminal pocket where time slowed, where the constant ache in her chest, the gnawing absence of the life she had lost seemed to pause, replaced by the almost terrifying sweetness of possibility. She found herself studying the curve of his jaw, the way his shoulders relaxed when he sensed her hesitation, the faint line at the corner of his mouth that suggested both mischief and empathy. It was a face that could have been carved from the rugged landscape itself, shaped by the sun, wind, and hard labor, yet softened by a gentleness he seemed determined to offer only to those willing to look beyond appearances. Emily's heart tightened with conflicting emotions, fear that she was moving too quickly, excitement that she had never thought possible, and a deep, almost spiritual recognition that perhaps, in the chaos of her grief, she had stumbled upon someone who could teach her again what it meant to feel alive. The cowboy stepped slightly closer, careful, deliberate, each motion measured yet fluid, as if he were attuned to the rhythm of her breathing, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the way her fingers lingered on the fence post like a lifeline, tethered to both past pain and potential healing. She noticed, almost against her will, the warmth radiating from him, a tangible force that made the cool evening air feel electric, charged, almost sacred, as though the universe had bent to conspire in this quiet, miraculous convergence of two wounded souls. His voice, when it came again, was softer now, infused with a resonance that seemed to settle into the hollow spaces she had carried for so long. Emily. I don't know your story, not fully, but I can see that you've been through more than most. And I won't pretend to fix it, but I can be here if you'll let me. The simplicity of the offer, the lack of grandiosity or performative sentiment struck her deeply, cutting through layers of protective bitterness she had wrapped around herself, and her throat tightened with the enormity of it. She had spent months hiding from the world, believing herself too fragile to be seen, too broken to be loved, and yet here he was, not demanding, not judging, merely present, offering space, and in that presence, she felt her defenses, long fortified with sorrow, begin to falter, crumble in the most exquisite and terrifying way. She took a small, unsteady step closer, her boots sinking into the soft prairie soil, and in that movement, felt the first real stirrings of desire, not a reckless, consuming hunger, but a gentle, insistent warmth that whispered of trust, of the possibility of intimacy, of the slow bloom of connection that could heal as much as it could awaken. The cowboy noticed, of course. She could see the way his eyes softened, how a subtle smile curved his lips, not indulgent, not condescending, but full of quiet reassurance. A silent vow to tread carefully, to honor the fragile terrain of her heart. And when he reached out again, this time letting his fingers brush against her cheek, the contact was almost unbearably intimate, an electric affirmation of the unspoken bond that had begun to form, and Emily's breath hitched, caught between the safety of solitude and the wild, uncharted promise of surrendering to the possibility of love. It was in that moment, with the sky deepening around them and the wind carrying the soft whispers of prairie grass and distant horses, that she realized the enormity of what she felt. Not just attraction, not just curiosity, but a profound sense of recognition, as if her soul had been wandering for years through a barren desert and had finally found an oasis of understanding, acceptance, and warmth. Her fingers trembled against the rough wood of the fence, and yet she did not pull away because in his gaze, in the patient, unwavering acknowledgement of her pain and her worth, she saw a reflection of herself she had thought forever lost. The woman who could feel, who could desire, who could hope again. And then, as if guided by some invisible force, the cowboy leaned in, slow and deliberate, his presence folding around her like a protective cloak, the faint scent of leather, earth and something uniquely him enveloping her senses. Her breath caught entirely, a shiver running down her spine, and she felt her heart hammer against her ribs with a force she had not known in months, raw and electric, and achingly alive. The space between them shrank until it was nothing more than the invisible tension of anticipation, the delicate, almost sacred dance of consent and desire, grief and hope, longing and restraint. She could feel the warmth of his lips almost before they touched, could feel the surge of emotion, the floodgate of feeling that had been dammed behind months of sorrow, beginning to break open. And in that infinitesimal pause, that brief hesitation where fear and courage met, Emily understood something vital, undeniable, that this kiss, if it came, would not just be a kiss. It would be a shattering of the grief that had held her captive, a reclamation of the parts of herself she had buried in ash, a declaration that life and love were not over even after tragedy. His eyes held hers in that moment, dark, steady, tender, and she saw in them not only desire but an unspoken promise, that he would meet her sorrow with patience, her fears with care, her heart with respect, and she gave herself, tentatively yet irrevocably, to that possibility. And then, when the prairie seemed to hold its collective breath, the world narrowing to the heat of his body near hers, the unspoken language of longing, and the electric anticipation of touch, he kissed her, softly, deliberately, with a tenderness that shattered the icy shell around her heart, a kiss that was at once gentle and urgent, comforting and awakening, and Emily felt, in a way so profound it left her breathless and trembling, that grief and hope could coexist, that love could bloom in the ruins of loss, and that she was finally alive again. The world seemed to hold its breath long after his lips left hers, the prairie falling silent in a way that made Emily feel as though the entire universe had paused to witness the fragile miracle of her heart beginning to breathe again. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, blinking against the dimming light, and she realized that the tremor she had felt in her limbs was not fear, but something far more profound, an awakening, a pulse of life that had lain dormant under the weight of grief for months, now rushing through her veins with a thrilling urgency. She could feel the warmth of his presence even in the absence of his lips, a magnetic pull that seemed to tether her to him, and she knew with a sudden clarity that this connection, fragile, tentative, but infinitely real, was unlike anything she had experienced in her years of solitude and sorrow. The cowboy stepped back slightly, giving her space yet remaining close enough that she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the subtle exhalation of earth and sun, the quiet assurance that he was there and would remain, patient and unwavering. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion, as the reality of what had just happened washed over her in waves, relief, longing, fear, hope, all mingling together in a tumultuous storm that left her simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. Her fingers lingered on the fence, gripping the rough wood as if it could anchor her to reality, yet every nerve ending seemed to hum with the memory of his touch, the ghost of his lips lingering on hers like a promise, a whispered declaration that life had not ended, that love had not abandoned her even after devastation. She realized almost with disbelief that she wanted more, not recklessly, not impulsively, but with the quiet, insistent certainty of someone who had long been denied the warmth of human connection, and now recognized its value in the marrow of her bones. The cowboy, perceptive as ever, tilted his head, a small knowing smile curving his lips as though reading the torrent of unspoken emotion that played across her face. "You're trembling," he murmured, low and intimate, his voice a velvet thread weaving itself through her consciousness. "I can't tell if it's the wind, or if it's me." His tone carried no judgment, no teasing mockery, only gentle recognition, and Emily felt her lips part in a laugh, soft and uneven, the sound rusty from disuse, yet liberating in its vulnerability. I don't know," she admitted, her voice a fragile whisper. "Maybe both." She dared a glance at him, her eyes meeting his in that moment, and she saw in their depths the same mix of curiosity and tenderness that had drawn her to him from the start, a reflection of her own unspoken yearning mirrored back with patience and respect. The wind picked up, rustling the prairie grasses around them, carrying with it the faint scent of evening earth and the residual warmth of a sun now dipped behind the horizon. Yet it did nothing to disturb the fragile bubble of intimacy that surrounded them. Time seemed suspended, elongated into a delicate dance where every glance, every sigh, every tentative gesture carried the weight of unspoken desire and the cautious hope of hearts learning to beat together again. After long months of solitude, Emily stepped closer, emboldened by the gentleness of his presence, and she noticed in the soft glow of twilight the subtle changes in his expression, the way his eyes softened even further, the faint parting of his lips as he waited, the quiet exhalation that seemed to invite her into a shared space of safety and trust. She allowed herself, tentatively yet irrevocably, to reach out, her hand brushing against his, fingers interlacing in a gesture that was at once simple and infinitely meaningful, a silent acknowledgement that she was willing to step beyond the boundaries of grief, to risk vulnerability, to let herself feel again. The contact sent a shiver up her spine, but it was no longer frightening. It was exhilarating, a tactile reminder that the world could hold warmth, comfort, and tenderness, and that she could partake in it without fear of being consumed by sorrow. He responded with the gentlest pressure of his fingers against hers, a grounding, deliberate affirmation that he understood the fragility of the moment and would meet it with patience, care, and unspoken devotion. For the first time since the tragedy that had reshaped her world, Emily felt a sense of equilibrium, not complete, not permanent, but a delicate balance between the weight of loss and the exhilarating possibility of rediscovery. Her chest rose and fell with unsteady rhythm, and she became acutely aware of the electric undercurrent that pulsed between them, subtle yet insistent, a quiet language of desire and trust that neither needed to articulate in words. The cowboy leaned closer, his presence wrapping around her like a protective shroud, and Emily felt her knees weaken slightly at the sheer intimacy of the gesture, a raw vulnerability she had not allowed herself to feel in months. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft sigh of the prairie wind. "I don't want to rush anything. I want to be here, with you." The simplicity, the quiet honesty of the declaration struck her with force, and she realized that what she had been craving for so long was not grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but this: presence, attentiveness, patience, and the unspoken promise that someone could hold space for her grief without trying to erase it. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, not of sorrow but of relief, release, and a profound, almost spiritual recognition that she had not been truly alone, that she could allow herself to trust, to lean, to desire again. They stood like that for what felt like hours, or perhaps minutes, the measurement of time rendered irrelevant by the intensity of shared presence. Emily's hand in his steady gaze meeting hers, and the prairie stretching around them in quiet witness to the rebirth of hope, the slow mending of a heart long weighed down by loss. And then, when the first stars began to shimmer faintly overhead, Emily rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady drum of his heart, a rhythm that seemed to sync with her own faltering pulse, and she realized with a clarity that brought a shiver of awe that this moment, the quiet aftermath of a kiss that had shattered the chains of grief, was not an ending but a beginning. It was a bridge between sorrow and possibility, between loss and love, between the frozen isolation of months and the slow, fragile thawing of her heart. She breathed in the scent of him, earth, leather, something uniquely him, and felt, for the first time since the fire, that she was allowed to hope again, allowed to want, allowed to feel without fear of being destroyed. And in that sacred silence where the prairie, the stars, and the wind seemed to conspire to honor the rebirth of her spirit, Emily knew, without doubt, without hesitation, that she had been given a gift far greater than mere physical touch, the promise of someone willing to hold her heart with care, to let her grief coexist with her desire, and to walk alongside her into the uncertain but tantalizingly real possibility of love. The night wrapped around the prairie like a velvet cloak, the stars scattered across the sky in shimmering constellations that seemed to echo the quiet miracle unfolding below, and Emily felt herself exhale a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. The cowboy stood beside her, close enough that the warmth of his body brushed against her arm, yet distant enough to honor the fragile space she still needed to navigate, and in that delicate balance she felt a sense of safety, a trust she had thought forever lost. She turned her face toward him, letting her gaze linger on the strong, steady profile of the man who had appeared seemingly from nowhere to awaken a part of her soul she had buried in ashes, and she realized with a shock of clarity that she no longer wanted to retreat into solitude, no longer wanted to hide behind the walls built of grief and fear. The gentle rise and fall of his chest beneath her fingertips, the faint scent of leather and earth that clung to him, the faint call of a distant owl echoing across the prairie. They were all reminders that life, even after tragedy, continued in moments of raw, unanticipated beauty. His hand found hers again, this time holding it firmly yet tenderly, and Emily felt an almost unbearable surge of emotion, relief, hope, desire, and a profound recognition that she had been seen, truly seen in ways that her grief had previously obscured. She leaned into his warmth instinctively, drawn to the steady reassurance of his presence, and the quiet intimacy of the gesture spoke volumes where words would have fallen short. "I don't want to let go," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of months spent in sorrow. "I don't want to lose this. Not again." His thumb traced gentle circles over the back of her hand, a grounding rhythm that made her heart ache and soar all at once. "You won't," he said softly, his voice a promise, a balm, a tether anchoring her to the present. "I'm not going anywhere. Not tonight, not ever, if you'll let me stay." The sincerity in his tone, the unspoken vow embedded in the simple words, struck her with the force of revelation, and Emily felt tears slip freely down her cheeks. Not of despair, but of release, gratitude, and a fragile joy she had feared was beyond her reach. They stood in silence for a long while, letting the night envelope them, letting the gentle hum of the prairie, the soft rustling of grass, the distant whisper of a stream, and the quiet beat of their hearts speak a language all their own, a language of healing, of connection, of tentative trust blossoming into something deeper. As she rested her head against his chest, she could feel the strength in him, not the physical kind, but the emotional, unwavering fortitude that reassured her that she was safe, that she could lower her guard without fear of judgment or betrayal. She had long believed that grief would be her eternal companion, that the fire that had stolen so much from her would leave an indelible mark of emptiness she could never fill. Yet in this quiet intimacy, she realized that grief and love could coexist, that sorrow could be softened by warmth, that the heart could expand to hold both the shadow of loss and the light of new beginnings. The cowboy shifted slightly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch feather-light yet profound, and she felt a thrill of anticipation run through her once again. Not fear, not apprehension, but a deep, soul-stirring recognition of possibility. "Emily," he murmured, bending his head so that his lips hovered just above hers. "You're extraordinary, in ways I can't even begin to describe, and I want to be here for all of it with you." She closed her eyes at the words, letting them sink in, let them mend the ragged edges of her spirit, let them awaken a desire she had long suppressed under layers of pain and fear. When his lips met hers again, it was with a new depth, a gentle but insistent claiming of trust and intimacy, a kiss that was both tender and grounding, exhilarating and comforting all at once. She responded instinctively, leaning into him, feeling the steady strength of his arms wrap around her in a protective embrace that seemed to whisper, without words, that she was no longer alone, that she could be loved and desired without fear, and that the world could hold joy alongside sorrow. The kiss lingered, stretching time into an almost infinite moment where only the two of them existed, where her grief softened into acceptance, where the ache of loss began to transform into the promise of renewal. When they finally parted, even if just slightly, Emily's eyes were glistening, her lips tingling, her heart racing with the intoxicating realization that love, real, patient, understanding love could arrive even in the aftermath of devastation, that it could heal and awaken and sustain in ways she had thought impossible. She rested her forehead against his once more, inhaling the faint scent of him, feeling the pulse of life that he carried like a steady drumbeat in the dark. And she understood with a clarity so profound it took her breath away that the world was no longer a place to merely survive, but a place to feel, to desire, to hope, and to love again. He whispered her name gently, almost reverently, and she leaned into him, surrendering not just to the warmth of his body, but to the undeniable truth that she had been given a gift beyond measure, the chance to reclaim herself from the ashes of grief, to step into the light of desire, to let someone in without fear, and to know, finally, that healing and love were not mutually exclusive. And as they stood together on the quiet prairie, the wind rustling softly through the grass, the stars burning like promises overhead, Emily realized that the fire that had once destroyed her world had also cleared the way for something new, something tender and real and achingly beautiful. And in that realization, She felt her heart expand in ways she had thought forever impossible. She allowed herself to close her eyes, to lean into the embrace fully, to let the warmth of this man, this presence, seep into her very soul, and for the first time in months, she smiled, not a small, fleeting smile, but one that carried the weight of survival, hope, desire, and the slow, certain promise of love that would no longer be denied. In that embrace, with the prairie stretching endlessly around them and the night sky holding witness, Emily understood something eternal, that the heart, no matter how deeply wounded, could heal, and that sometimes the simplest touch, the gentlest kiss, the quiet patience of another human being, could shatter grief forever, leaving in its place a space vast enough to hold both sorrow and the radiant, unshakable beauty of love.